Hi, welcome to season 2 of my podcast, All About Her. I'm your host, Shreya Anand, and I'm a high schooler interested in STEM. Join me as I speak to various women in STEM to learn all about her experiences and advice for girls like me. Wowee, it has been a second since I last posted, guys, but I'm back with a holiday special interview. Before I introduce today's speaker, though, I do want to say that I have gone ahead and put in little timestamps for each of the questions that I ask in today's interview. So if you're interested, instead of watching the whole interview, you can go ahead and skip to the specific questions that you might find most useful or most interesting to you. So that's going to be down below in the description. So today I will be speaking to a woman who is an assistant professor of chemical engineering at the University of Washington. She's also the founder of Women in Chemical Engineering, an organization committed to empowering female chemical engineers all over the country. It has many different chapters. So without further ado, please welcome Dr. Elizabeth Nance, and let's jump straight into this amazing interview. Thank you so much for joining me today, Dr. Nance. Would you mind just quickly explaining what your current career is and what you specialize in?
Yeah, of course. I'm happy to be here. So I am a professor in chemical engineering at the University of Washington. That means that I typically do some combination of teaching and running a research program. And our research program is focused on trying to understand how the brain responds to injury and develop better therapies to treat that injury. And we kind of take an engineering plus neuroscience and some data science sort of approach to tackling that problem.
Wow, that's really, really incredible. Before we get into, I guess, all the fields that you're involved in, let's go into the fun questions of the interview. So,
yes.
First off, what was your favorite toy or game as a child when you were growing up?
Yeah, I think for me, it was always puzzles. So not like one particular toy or game, but I just loved doing puzzles. I would puzzle like all the time when we were on vacation, when I was at home, when I was just like bored and needed something to do. And my favorite thing was to do the same puzzle enough times where, this is really nerdy, where then I could flip it over where the picture wasn't shown, it was just the back, and then build it that way. Like that's the level of puzzling that I would get myself into, which, you know, I don't know, take it for what you will.
Are you still into building puzzles and things like that?
Yes, definitely. We often have a puzzle at home that's kind of in the works. That and reading have been kind of my two biggest de-stressing hobbies for like an indoor activity. And so I more rely on reading as a way to kind of get my brain to slow down and just kind of, you know, have a relaxation sort of rest time. But we definitely always have puzzles in the house, and usually one going.
That's so fun. All right, next question. What is your favorite molecule? Because I know you do a lot of biomolecular engineering as well, so anything there?
Yeah, I'm definitely going to have to say anything that is a part of chocolate is my, I have a necklace that has, you know, like anything that would tie into any active ingredient in chocolate is what I would go for, including caffeine in its form of chocolate, like in the form it's in chocolate. Yeah, all things chocolate is what I'm going with. So anything in chocolate is what I'll go for.
Fantastic answer. And then last question, a little bit more, I guess, into what you actually do. What is your most favorite paper you have published so far?
Oh, that is a tough question. There's so many that I really like aspects of. I'll give you kind of a general answer first, and then I'm happy to give like a specific answer. I really like papers that address nuance. So papers that we've published that, you know, are really nuanced and are really trying to get at maybe things where there's a lot of conflict or conflicting information in the field. So that's some of my favorite stuff. One of my favorite papers right now is this paper that we just put out where we were studying how nanoparticles move in the brain and how we could use their movement to predict the age of the brain. And so the idea was that, like, could you predict when a brain starts to deviate from normal aging? So could you predict when somebody's maybe aging too early or aging in a way that indicates onset of disease? And so that's right now, like, it's based on this really fundamental biological principle of diffusion, of how things move within the brain microenvironment. And we've started to bring in, the data science aspect and the neuroscience aspect. And this is kind of a cool paper, and it's the intersection of engineering, data science, and neuroscience, and really shows maybe the power of some of this data and what we could potentially do with it. And so it's a really deep dive nerdy paper, but it's like, it's a really cool one that shows a lot of interdisciplinary and kind of where these different fields can intersect.
That's absolutely incredible. I think this is the perfect segue into talking more about your career specifically. But before we get into what you're currently working on, did you always kind of imagine yourself in a field that either like involved so many different like interdisciplinary ideas or just engineering in general? Did you ever see yourself doing that growing up?
The honest answer is no for engineering or for being a professor. I was very much somebody who loved to be outdoors. I was very much somebody, and I would, like, my neighbors and I would play like spy games. We would make up, adventure games. So it was all very kind of like sort of towards the puzzling thing, like finding puzzles to solve. So maybe that was like the early indication. I didn't know that was like an engineering thing when I was younger. But I was always also very interested in animals and in like animal behavior and, taking care of animals. And so for the longest time, I really wanted to be a vet. That still is an interest of me in my career. I just can't figure out a way to take 3 years off from being a faculty to go to vet school, but it's on my radar if the option ever presents itself. And then journalism was the other area of interest that I was kind of exploring. And journalism was more because I really enjoyed reading a lot. So I loved storytelling. I loved creating characters and storylines and kind of thinking about how do you convey something in written form. And so those were the early areas that I was interested in. I explored things in middle school and high school that were kind of opportunities to engage with those type of activities. But because of the number of neurological diseases that my family experienced, I also was interested in finding ways to better help my family members. And engineering seemed to be always presented as a problem-solving tool. And so I was thinking, okay, well, if engineers can problem solve, maybe I can go into this degree area and figure out tools or approaches to how I could potentially solve problems to help, like problems that afflicted my family. So, neurological diseases. And that was really the best definition I had at the time of like what I wanted to do. It was definitely not a linear process from there to ending up where I am now. And I didn't decide that I wanted to be a faculty until I was well into my like later training as a postdoc, actually. So after I got my PhD, but obviously I kept it on my radar as something that could be potentially done. So all that to say is that I was interested in a lot of things. I always explored a lot of things. And I think that part of that exploration was just kind of figuring out, well, where can I feel like I had the most impact, and where can I also do things in ways that I like approaching thinking about stuff or solving or spending like mental energy or spending thought time. So lots of different stuff factored into that.
So I guess talking more about what you currently study, I've read a lot about different things like inflammation-induced brain injury is one of the main phrases that I saw kind of coming up. Translational medicine. How exactly does all of this fit together? Because, like you said, the view of engineering is kind of limited in the sense that, you build things or something like that. But
right.
How do you apply that, I guess, in your field?
Yeah, so I think thinking about inflammation is a great example, right? So inflammation is something that is often a good response in our body. It can be used to signal to your body that something is wrong and that you need to respond to kind of get it back under control. But it, like most things, can get out of control, right? And it can become bad. It can become pathogenic. It can become negatively impactful. And when that occurs in the brain, it can be tied into or progress the sort of onset of a lot of diseases. And so most neurological diseases have some form of inflammation that is not good playing a role. And so we're really interested in ways in which we can design drug delivery systems or therapies that could help suppress that inflammation to kind of correct it back to levels that are healthy for the brain and good for the brain. So like more anti-inflammatory rather than pro-inflammatory is kind of how we would think about it. This gets into thinking about inflammation, not just on its own, but well, how does it interact in this greater complex system, right? So inflammation is one type of process that occurs in diseases, but it's not the only type of process. There's other things like cell death, oxidative stress, where you're getting a lot of overload of free radicals and other things that can cause damage to cells. There's other processes that go on either along with inflammation or in response to inflammation. And so there's a bigger system at play. And this is where I think engineers are really well equipped to tackle problems in medicine, in humans, in health, in biology, is that you have the opportunity to think about systems and think about, okay, there's a lot of competing factors. There's a lot of complementary factors, and they all interplay. What matters and how much of it matters? And if you tweak one thing, how does it affect the rest of the system? And how do you control that? And I think that's where the engineering mentality really can come into play when we're thinking about how disease occurs, how we treat disease, and how disease varies from person to person, right? Because you also have this like scalability factor. If you have a neurological disease diagnosed as Alzheimer's and somebody else has a neurological disease diagnosed as Alzheimer's, what is the same between those two people and what's different, and how much of that affects how this whole system works and how we might design something to modulate that system, like in the case of a therapeutic. So that to me is super cool. It's really complex, which I love, but it's a great way to think like in your engineering training, and this isn't unique to chemical engineering. Most engineering trainings think about things from a systems perspective. How do you build up something that works to drive a system? How do you build up something that controls a system? How do you build up something that is a system itself? Like, right, there's so many different ways that engineers kind of play a role in thinking about systems and how parts of those systems or the system as a whole acts. And so I think that's a really great thing to bring an approach to bring into health and medicine, particularly in thinking about treating disease or preventing disease. And I'm just talking about from the human body, right? We can think about systems from environmental effects, socioeconomic policy, like infrastructure, right? Like there are so many ways to think about how different levels of systems and what we mean by the system actually influence our health as human beings, and the effectiveness of therapies we might develop or implement. So I think it's super cool and a great place for engineers to kind of come into play, which is really what inspired me, is like this complexity. It's a system, like engineers problem solve, but they also have to understand how the solutions they're providing work in these broader systems.
I think that's just a really amazing explanation of like, I've never really thought about how I guess a cure might affect one person to another person in any kind of disease, and using engineering in that context makes so much sense now that I kind of think about it. So that's really incredible. I guess another aspect of that is the nanoparticle technology that you also work on. I had to search up how big a nanoparticle was, I will admit, and it's so tiny. So how exactly does that work?
Yeah, it's a great question, because you think about how does something that small have an effect, right? And this is where I find the field of chemical engineering really fascinating. So chemical engineers are really trained to think about things that span length and time scales. So how do we think about how something that's designed on the nanoscale, so 10,000 times smaller than the diameter of your hair, right? So something that you cannot see yourself, and is super, super tiny, right? How do we think how something that small can change cognitive function, right? If we're putting a drug into it, and we're delivering it into a person, and we're expecting it to have an effect on that person's neurological disease, which would then tie into their behavior or their ability to think or their ability to have, cognitive function in a way that allows them to control muscle or to, process memories or to react to things, right? That's a huge difference in scale, right? It's a huge difference in length scale, like going from a nanoparticle to the whole human body and their interaction with the environment, as well as time scale. Like thinking about like what is a nanoparticle doing on the time scale nano would experience with what does a human do on the time scale of their behavior, their interactions, memory formation, memory storage, all that sort of thing. I think that's fascinating. And that's the cool thing that chemies do. And they do this in a ton of different fields. We kind of work in this space, but, chemical engineering kind of covers length and time scale and thinking about making stuff broadly accessible to humans that's in a cost-effective way for a number of different disciplines. So to me, that's super cool. But like nanotechnology is a really great example because it is really tiny, but most of biology, most of the functional units of biology are on that same order of magnitude. So proteins, DNA, RNA, right? These are all operating and functional on the nanoscale. And we see this connection in biology between what a protein does, what your DNA results in, right? What the regulation of your DNA and your RNA, how that actually translates to factors like skin color, eye color, hair color, like so many things, like even, if it's regulation of DNA, like how we experience and interpret, the world around us, like so many different factors, right, that can influence down at the nanoscale all the way up to populations of humans or individual humans to populations of humans. And so when we're designing technologies that act on the nanoscale, there's also the potential to see their impact on sort of those longer length and time scales. And that's what we're really interested in, like what connects between these two things? What do we manipulate on the nanoscale that could have an effect on the length and time scale that is relevant to human behavior, human function, human cognition, that sort of thing? And that's where I think the therapeutic piece really comes in, because we're trying to load drugs into these really tiny systems to help get those drugs more effectively to parts in the brain. But in reality, we're trying to affect the function of the brain, right? Like the whole organ and how that plays out in the whole human. And that sort of thinking across length and time scale, I think, is super, super cool, but also really powerful if you can leverage a technology that can do that.
So as you've been mentioning, this is like a really incredible field in the sense that it kind of just like carries like a link in between so many different fields at the same time. But I would assume that there are a lot of struggles that you faced along the way as you've been doing this. So what do you think was the biggest moment of struggle and learning for you as you've been doing research?
Yeah, this is something that I've thought a lot about because it comes into how I mentor and train my students. I think it's really important when we're working in these really complex spaces to have a certain level of appreciation and understanding of all the factors that go into contributing to that complexity. And that can often be perceived as not having expertise because you're too dilute or you're not specialized in a certain area. And so it's really interesting that, in particularly scientific settings, we historically value expertise around a very narrow topic for an individual. And I think there's a lot of value in us rethinking that. So can we actually value expertise in people who intentionally sit in multiple fields purely for the purpose of connecting those fields? They therefore need to have enough of an understanding of each of those fields to identify where are there gaps, where are there things that can translate from one to the other. But there's no feasible way that they can have the expert level, somebody who specializes in that field understanding, right? And where's the line? Where is too general versus too specialized? And so that's been one of the biggest challenges, both in my own training in kind of finding a home, like a scientific home, as well as in figuring out where that line is. Like, how much expertise do we really need to develop in this to make an impact and have a difference and make a difference? And how much do we want to actually stay a bit more generalized because we don't want to get kind of blinders on about a certain way of thinking about things or a certain kind of way of defining things that could be unique to a very specific field or a very specific approach, but could then limit us to seeing other potential technologies or advances or people to connect with or whatever that might be able to bring in new information, new expertise, new ideas to an existing field. And I think there's a lot of opportunity there, but there's also a lot of challenge. And some things have worked well and other things have been sort of a struggle. For example, I go to like 6 or 7 different conferences a year to get that each are representative of each field we kind of pull from to get that intellectual input. And there's no like single conference where I could go and have all the intellectual input there, right? So that's a lot of time, it's a lot of money, it's a lot of energy invested. And that makes it a little bit more difficult of also really investing enough time into each of those to maybe get out of it, more meaningful interactions or more meaningful relationships for what you need. And so that's just one example of where there's a potential challenge. But then we pull things from other fields all the time that I think allow us to push technology, allow us to push understanding in a way that if we were coming at it from a single field or really tied to a specific perspective in a single field, we would not be able to advance or not be able to push as much. So again, there's a lot of opportunity with it. There's some challenges, and I think it's just an awareness of kind of where those are and how to kind of bring people into these sort of spaces that straddle multiple fields that really needs to be done, so you don't get so overwhelmed and so lost that you can't actually make progress in the way that you want to.
I think you bring up a really good point because nowadays I feel like a lot of people that I've spoken to, a lot of people that I know are, they're really like interested in just learning a lot. And that's an amazing quality to have. But at the same time, like, where do you kind of draw that balance so you can really hone in on what you enjoy and at the same time can contribute to? So, and
it's hard when you're in training too, right?
Yeah.
Because like in school, you have to major in something, right? Like you go in and you major in something. And so there's certainly coursework and a specific emphasis around what you're majoring in. And that could limit kind of the array of other things you explore. In talking with undergraduates or talking with students who are kind of coming through degree programs, one of the things I encourage is thinking about, education holistically. It's not just what you're getting in the classroom, right? It's also what you're getting experiences for outside of the classroom. And so if they're, having a degree is a defined degree discipline is useful because that allows for job avenues, that allows for specific training on tools and skills and approaches that then are recognized by employers or recognized by the broader kind of communities that you might be interacting with. But that you're not limited to developing skills and experiences from just your class content, right? And your class content also has some flexibility to take electives and take other classes that aren't tied into your specific degree program. And so I think it's one area where we, like, when I say we, I mean professors and faculty and academia can do better at kind of encouraging people to experience things holistically, not just from the classroom perspective, but in getting engaged in activities, clubs, student organizations, volunteer efforts, shadowing opportunities, things like that, where, you're not going to be super in-depth in it, but you get at least a taste, you get a little bit of an exposure, and you can see if it's something you want to invest more of your time on. And I think taking those opportunities away too early by forcing people into specialization too early can risk a lot of sort of, more what if, like the what ifs, more people that end up with more of the what ifs, but then also can really kind of narrow the thinking, and you miss out on probably getting different perspectives and even sometimes disagreeing perspectives that can really help you in the field you end up going into, because you're seeing things in different ways and you're kind of used to taking in information in a learning format. And by learning, I mean you're not an expert in it. So you're not so kind of set in the ways of things. And so you kind of take things in more, if that makes sense.
Yeah, definitely. I guess talking more about, teaching and teaching at the University of Washington, I also know that you started this Women in Chemical Engineering sort of organization there. So I guess talking more about what you've noticed with your students, and like the struggles that they're facing along with this kind of struggle of just majoring in something and sticking with it. How about like the sort of underrepresented groups that I guess you're kind of seeing, and you're also teaching like this, what I feel is the brand new generation of kind of people joining STEM. So how do you view that right now?
Yeah, it's a great question. One of the reasons we founded Women in Chemie was because the chemical engineering undergraduate and graduate student population was about 30% women in terms of representation as a national average. And that varied anywhere from like 25% to maybe 32, 33%. And then as you got more and more advanced, at least in academia, but this is also true in engineering, chemical engineering professions, that representation starts to drop significantly. So we're talking like down to 19% for faculty. And so like if you go through PhD and then a postdoc and then go into faculty, your sort of attrition is from 30-ish% down to 19%. If you look at CEOs and representation in industry, I mean, this is true of every industry, but certainly in engineering disciplines and engineering fields, representation is quite low, under 20%. And if you look at like different levels of sort of the executive positions, right, the executive suites, it's certainly quite low. And if we think about the fact that, you know, the representation, and that's just from, you know, gender identification, right? And that is just binary gender identification. We're not even talking about non-binary individuals who are trans, and you know, and then we're not bringing in any sexual orientation as well, right? And so we're still even talking about that in a binary setting. And so representation of other individuals, individuals of different racial and ethnic groups, individuals with disabilities. I mean, we do not have representation that I think is adequate to allow for students not just to see themselves, but also to gain the perspective from people with different lived experiences that could inform and enlighten their engineering applications, their engineering approaches. And this is especially important when we're developing products, right? We can see this in every part of life, in how infrastructure is designed, in how we think about sustainable technologies, in how AI and machine learning are applied, right? Like this is, and how therapies are distributed, how medicines, like in terms of socioeconomic status, you know, everything, like how this is all developed. We need this diversity of perspectives to really be able to provide solutions that are truly global solutions and serve any and all populations of people. And so we started Women in Chemie kind of with this idea in mind that we want to 30% isn't a lot, but when you get everybody together, it feels like a lot more. And so it was mostly about bringing community together, but then also creating a space for conversation and advocacy, creating a space for making those connections to realize that, yes, it's 30%, but that 30% is still quite powerful. And that is something that I think was really important for us, is not to be defined by the fact that we were only 30%, but to say 30% can do a lot. What can we do, and how can we empower others, and how can we bring people along with us? It's not just on women and individuals who are underrepresented to advocate, right? It is on the majority as well. And so that's something that I think was really exciting to build, and we're continuing to build it. We're establishing chapters at other universities. Our goal is to have a nationwide Women in Chemie network, where we have a Women in Chemie chapter at every university that has a chemical engineering program. And it's not to say that, you know, there's a certain target number of representation. It's more to bring women in and other individuals in who are underrepresented in our discipline as leaders, as supervisors, as mentors, as colleagues, as peers, right? As people that you will be supervising. So really to increase that exposure and that opportunity to learn from individuals that you might not have had the opportunity to learn from in any setting prior to, you know, exposure in undergrad or into grad school, or maybe never even ever. And I think that is really where we want to, you know, kind of normalize expectations that anybody can be your colleague, and anybody should be able to be your colleague. Anybody should be able to be your boss, your leader, your mentor, your go-to, like your friend, whatever, right? Like, and they all have valuable ideas, and they all have important perspectives to bring to the table. And that takes everybody committing to that mentality and that perspective to really be able to, I think, to drive that. It's been really valuable for me as a faculty. When I started, I was the first female faculty hire in a little while, and you know, it was a little overwhelming. I didn't really, simple things like I didn't have anybody to get feedback on, like, who do they go see an OBGYN for? Like, you know, where do you get your hair cut? Like, I mean, it was silly stuff. Like, it can feel silly, but it was just conversations I couldn't have with my male colleagues, right? And so there has been a benefit of just creating community, even to talk about shared experiences or shared, you know, topics of discussion that could be important. And that doesn't have to come from people at your own level. It can come, like, this, you know, this view that hierarchy, like seniority dictates mentoring or dictates experience or whatever. Like, it always boggles my mind. There are so many students I work with who have so many lived experiences that are insightful or are valuable, are, you know, experiences they've had that they can teach me something about indirectly or otherwise, or directly. And I think it's really good for us to kind of work away from this mentality that it has to be somebody senior to you to to support you, to mentor you, to guide you, right? And I think creating these communities can give you access to individuals and build networks that aren't dependent on these sort of fixed hierarchies that we see in a lot of our sort of career settings.
So, final kind of question to kind of bring everything together, if you will. Do you have any advice that either you still refer to or that you've kind of learned along your journey for other girls and other people who generally want to pursue a career in chemical engineering and who are also kind of struggling along the way?
Yeah, I think it ties back into kind of something we were talking about before, which is, I generally believe that most experiences that you seek out in undergrad or in grad school or in high school can be valuable experiences, and that there's not a right or wrong, if that makes sense. So there's no one right major to pick. There's no one right set of classes to take. Timing is also, there's no right timing for everything. I think we get really caught up in these kind of perceived expectations of doing X, Y, and Z to get to, whatever the end goal is, or doing it on a specific time scale. And that really limits our ability to explore and to be creative and to try stuff and to fail and to experience things we don't like, right? But everything that you experience that you don't like is one more data point that gives you a sense of what you do like. And so I think, I always kind of encourage people to not let go of that curiosity and exploratory nature. And that, there's no one right way to do things, right? Even every faculty has a different way to how they became a faculty. Yeah, there's certain degrees we had to get to be a faculty, but the way we did it and when we did it and our timing between the things is quite different between different faculty, and our motivations for it and how we invested time in it. All of that is different. And so I think it's good just to, there's an important piece of you shouldn't lose in that process. And there's an important piece of being curious, exploring, trying out stuff, and that's okay to do. And you don't have to get it right every time. There isn't necessarily a right or a wrong. And there's no fixed time scale that it has to be done on. And I'm saying this as somebody who oversees our undergrad program in ChemE, who sees a lot of stress around students with expected timescales to complete things, and who hasn't seen evidence on the other side that if they don't do it by a certain time, it results in whatever definition of the end of things that it would be, right? And so that's something I really, try and encourage people to do. I wish I had focused more on that intentionally. I did a lot of things because I felt like I had to rather than because I wanted to. I mean, I did want to, but it was kind of an external pressure of I should do all these things and I should do them on this really tight time scale. And I really wish I had sort of learned earlier that all of that was it was a real pressure to me, but there was no real reason for it to be there, if that makes sense. And so that exploration, to explore for the sake of exploring, I think is something I wish I had embraced a little earlier, because then you can find your communities, you can find the things that you really enjoy, you can find kind of different ways that you could approach problems that others might be approaching, but you might bring a new perspective to. And I think that's something really valuable that we shouldn't overlook.
Well, thank you again for joining me today, Dr. Nance. I really appreciate your time and, sharing all your experience and advice with everyone. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
I hope you guys enjoyed today's interview. I learned so much about Dr. Nance's journey of being a research scientist and the importance of interdisciplinary science. So don't forget to go ahead and like and subscribe to my channel. Check out Dr. Nance's LinkedIn down below for even more information about the amazing work that she does. And follow my Instagram for more updates about the show, which will be coming out more regularly, I promise. And in the meanwhile, of course, stay safe, stay strong, and stay snazzy. Happy holidays!